Hey, all. Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Today, I want to take you to Louisiana on June 13th, 1863. Along the Mississippi River, about 35 miles north, as the crow flies, from Baton Rouge, is the hamlet of St. Francisville. There, in a church cemetery, a military funeral took place in the Masonic section of the hallowed grounds. Here, men in uniform gathered with heads bowed and hats in hand to pay respects to a fallen comrade, a poignant moment played out too many times in the war ravaged South. Though the scene was tragically all too common, the circumstances were quite extraordinary. The deceased was the respected commander of a United States gunboat, the Albatross. He's pictured here, John E. Hart. He's a New York born and Naval Academy educated officer. He was the grandson and namesake of a Navy lieutenant killed during the War of 1812. Half a century later, Hart followed in the footsteps of his grandfather and went off to war. Assigned to the Gulf Squadron as an officer aboard the sloop Vincennes, Hart left behind his wife of 6 years, Hattie, and a young son. He wrote in a letter, quote, "I do so hope that my little wife and my little one's prayers will be heard by our Heavenly Father, and I hope that I may be spared to come home again. If I am not, we will all try to meet, won't we?" End quote. That was in the summer of 1861 to Hattie. His idea of a heavenly meeting probably included a reunion with his second son who had died in infancy only a few years earlier. Hart took charge of the Albatross as lieutenant commander in late 1862. A small gunboat with a little firepower, she made a big name for herself in the Gulf. Hart scored several successes, including the destruction of valuable salt works along a stretch of the Florida coast. His most notable accomplishment was running the batteries of Port Hudson, Louisiana. It was on March 14th, 1863, when Rear Admiral David Farragut led a fleet of 7 ships past the formidable defenses of the fortress city. Farragut's ship, the Hartford, with Hart's little Albatross lashed to her side, ran the gauntlet with minimum casualties and damage. The rest of the fleet, however, was forced back and one vessel was destroyed. Only 2 ships made it past, the Farragut and the Albatross. Farragut complimented Hart in his after action report. Quote, "It was not Lieutenant Commander Hart's power to do much. Still, he did all that was in his power, and whenever he could bring a gun to bear, ahead or astern, on the port side, it was instantly fired." End quote. High words of praise from Farragut. The Hartford and the Albatross steamed into a section of the river between the last 2 Confederate strongholds, Port Hudson and Vicksburg, and there they began operations with other Union vessels that were already in the vicinity, and they went up against critical enemy supply bases. The Albatross was upriver from Port Hudson near Bayou Sarah on June 7th, 1863, when Hart penned an upbeat letter to Hattie. He wrote to her, quote, "My little boat is quite a wonder and is as well known on this river as the name of the river itself." End quote. He looked to the future and longed for the fall of Port Hudson. Quote, "I want to see the old flag on those cliffs, and I shall be quite delighted," end quote, talking about the heights of Port Hudson. Then, only 4 days later, 4:15 in the afternoon of June 11th, 1863, Hart sat down in his stateroom, pressed the muzzle of a pistol behind his right ear, and pulled the trigger. A steward rushed into the stateroom after hearing the shot, and he found Hart stretched out on the floor with blood oozing from his head and the pistol lying nearby. The ship's surgeon was summoned and rushed to the scene, but it was too late. Hart was dead at age 39. What happened? The accepted reason he took his own life was attributed to remittent fever that affected his brain and drove him insane. Hart did, in fact, suffer at the time from remittent fever and, quote, frequent paroxysms of excessive despondency, end quote. That's what the ship's surgeon had to say. But the surgeon also explained, quote, for several months past, he has been subject at times to great depression of spirits, end quote. A note in Hart's handwriting was tucked underneath a vase on a bureau in the stateroom. It revealed a darker secret, quote, I am dyspeptic. Will God forgive this rash act? It has been a mania with me for years. God knows my sufferings, end quote. The crew was shocked. Hart's second in command, First Lieutenant Theodore B. Dubose, turned the Albatross around and charted a course for the Hartford. While en route, she was intercepted by the steamer B with orders from the Hartford to return immediately to Bayou Sara. Dubose had no choice. He followed orders. He anchored the Albatross at Bayou Sara about 10 o'clock that night, sent an officer named William Harcourt ashore to find a coffin to preserve as best he can Hart's body so that it could be sent home to Harriet in New York for burial. Harcourt, despite his best efforts, could not find a suitable coffin. Then the decision was made to bury Hart along the river. But Dubose explained, quote, feeling most anxious to preserve his body and knowing that all traces of a grave on the bank of the river would certainly soon be lost, I determined to apply at the Church of St. Francisville, a beautiful little town about 1 mile back from Bayou Sara, for permission to bury him, end quote. Dubose added, taking with me a strong guard, I proceeded to the church and made my application, end quote. Dubose learned that the plot was available for non-resident Masons. As he and the late Hart were both Masons, the plot was perfectly suited for the remains. Dubose went to the local lodge in St. Francisville to seek permission to bury Hart there. Well, first contact with the Southern Masons and the United States Masons didn't go well. Dubose recalled, quote, I had great difficulty in obtaining admission to the lodge. On requesting it, I was told they considered me an enemy to their country, one who had come to deprive them of their homes and liberty, and they wished to have nothing to do with me, end quote. Dubose argued that as a Mason, he had the right to have his request honored. Quote, in the body of a just lodge, there can be neither politics nor civil war, end quote, he reminded his Southern brothers. The words of Dubose were persuasive. The senior lodge brother present, a man named William W. Leake, granted the request. Leake could well appreciate the higher bonds of Masonry and the military connection. He himself was a former captain in the 1st Louisiana Cavalry and an officer on the staff of Port Hudson's commanding general, Frank Gardner. Union cavalry had captured him a month earlier and released him on parole. Leake awaited a formal exchange from his home in St. Francisville, where he and his family had endured shelling from Hart's Albatross, as well as other Union warships. On June 13, 1863, Dubose and 50 of his crewmen accompanied Hart's body on that final journey. Dubose recounted, quote, I took our brother's remains on shore, and as we marched mournfully up the hill to the beautiful little church of St. Francisville, we were met by a procession of brother Masons who took charge of the coffin. Exchanging my sidearms for the snow white Masonic apron, I joined them, my men following on. We buried our brother with Masonic honors, end quote. DuBose added, quote, I feel sure that every Mason on the spot felt better for having done his duty towards the remains of a deceased brother, though an enemy in war, still a brother, end quote. The event, that day, the burial of a United States naval officer in the hallowed grounds of the cemetery, St. Francisville, came to be known by locals as the day the war stopped. A simple cypress headboard marked the burial spot until about 1900, when the rotted wood was replaced with a headstone by the U.S. Navy at the request of the Daughters of the Confederacy. Leake decorated the grave with flowers until he died. That was in 1912. Leake was buried near Hart, and the Masons added a marble slab covering both graves. It was in a 1956 ceremony. About 40 years later, in 1999, the town of St. Francisville held its first annual festival to remember that day, the day the war stopped in 1863, when the war was suspended to bury a brother Mason. That ceremony, the day the war stopped, is still held today. So thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.